The old man didn't say a word when he walked in. He just set the watch on the counter, gently, the way you'd set down something that had once belonged to someone you loved, and then he folded his hands and waited. Owen Marchand was 79 years old. He had a face like weathered cedar, creased and grey at the temples, and he wore a plaid jacket that had seen better decades. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain why he was there. He simply looked at the young man behind the counter the way a man looks at a locked door he's not sure he has the key to. The young man's name was Tyler Beckett. He was 31, trained in Switzerland, and his shop, Precision Time on Rue Principale in the old quarter of Gatineau, had been featured twice in Quebec's trade journals. There were framed certificates behind him. A magnifying headset rested on the shelf. The display cases gleamed. Everything about the place said, "We know what we're doing here." Beckett picked up the watch. It was a Hamilton 992B railway-grade pocket watch. 17 jewels, gold-filled case, the kind of piece that came out of Illinois in the early 1940s and was issued to men who needed to keep time so that trains, and other things, ran exactly on schedule. The crystal was scratched badly. The case had a small dent near the crown, and when Beckett turned it over and popped the case back, he could see immediately that the mainspring had fractured, snapped clean through, and that the balance wheel was canted off its pivot at an angle that made him wince. He set it back down. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "It was my father's," Owen Marchand said. Beckett turned the watch over again in his hand, not unkindly, but with the efficiency of a man delivering a verdict he'd given for. "The mainspring's gone, that I can work with, but the balance staff is broken, snapped right at the pivot. You can see the wheel is sitting crooked." He tilted the open case back toward the old man. "For a modern movement, I'd order a replacement staff. For this one," he paused, setting it down again, "there aren't any. Hamilton stopped producing parts for this caliber decades ago. I've checked the usual suppliers. Cousins UK, Offray, Jules Borel. Nothing." Marchand looked at the watch on the counter. "So it can't be fixed," he said. Not a question, just a man repeating what he'd been told to make sure he'd heard it right. "Not to a standard I'd stand behind," Beckett said. He wasn't unkind about it. He was 20 years past learning that honesty delivered plainly was better than hope delivered poorly. "I could put it in a display case for you. Frame it if you'd like. It's a beautiful piece. But as a functioning watch," he shook his head, "I wouldn't want to take your money for something I can't do." Owen Marchand nodded slowly. He looked at the watch for another long moment. Then he looked up at the certificates on the wall. Then back at Beckett. "Do you mind," he said, "if I take a look at it myself? There are men in this world who carry their history quietly, the way some rivers carry their depth. You'd never know from the surface how far down it goes." Owen Marchand was that kind of man. If you'd passed him on the street in Gatineau, at the Tim Hortons on Maloney, or walking along the river path in autumn when the maples go the colour of fire, you'd have seen an old man in a plaid jacket and taken no particular notice. You wouldn't have known that he'd spent 3 years in the army before most of his friends had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. You wouldn't have known about the year he spent as a watchmaker's apprentice after he came home, working in a tiny shop in Hull under a Belgian immigrant named Picard who'd learned the trade in Liège and brought every bit of it with him across the Atlantic. You wouldn't have known that Owen Marchand had, by the time he turned 26, repaired over 200 timepieces with his own hands. Pocket watches, wrist watches, ship's chronometers, and that his fingers still remembered the work even if his eyes weren't what they used to be. He didn't talk about any of that. He hadn't for a long time. What he talked about, on the rare occasions he talked, was his father, Arthur Marchand, a man who'd worked the rail lines out of Ottawa during the war years, when the railways were the lifeblood of a country sending men and material overseas as fast as they could be organised. Arthur Marchand had carried the 992B every day of his working life. It was a railway timepiece, which meant it wasn't just a watch. It was a certification, a standard, a tool as serious as any in a railman's kit. The time on that watch had to be exact. Lives depended on it, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, relentless way that punctuality and precision prevent disasters that never get written up in the papers because they never happen. Arthur Marchand had given Owen that watch on the day Owen shipped out. He'd pressed it into his son's hands at the train station in Ottawa, the same station where he'd punched his own time card for 15 years, and said, without ceremony, "Don't lose it." Owen hadn't. He'd carried it through 2 provinces, across an ocean, and back again. It had sat in his breast pocket through the cold and through the noise and through the long months when the main occupation was waiting. When he came home, his father was still alive and he gave the watch back, and Arthur Marchand put it on his shelf and said, "Good, now you can put it down." Arthur had been gone for 11 years, and the watch, which had sat on Owen Marchand's own shelf for all that time, had finally stopped. He hadn't been in any hurry to fix it, but then his granddaughter, Isabeau, 14 years old, full of questions, always pulling at his sleeve to look at the old things in his apartment, had asked him one afternoon what the watch was for, and he'd tried to explain. And somewhere in the middle of the explanation, he'd realized he wanted it to work again. He wanted her to hear it tick. Beckett hesitated. It was a reasonable request, a man asking to look at his own property, but there was something in the way Owen Marchand said it that made Beckett slow down. Not suspicion, something more like curiosity. The old man's voice was calm, his hands resting on the counter were still. "Of course," Beckett said, and slid the watch across. Owen Marchand picked it up without looking at it immediately. He felt the weight of it in his palm first, the way you greet an old friend before you look them in the eye. Then he drew it closer and examined the open case back. The shop had good light. He turned the watch slightly to catch it better. "Do you have a loop?" he asked. Beckett reached under the counter and handed him a 10x jeweler's loop. Owen Marchand seated it in his eye socket with the ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, and Beckett, who'd been watching with polite patience, went very still. There's a particular way that trained hands move around a delicate mechanism. Watchmakers recognize it the way musicians recognize technique, not by looking for it, but by noticing its absence when it isn't there, and its presence when it is. Owen Marchand's fingers moved around the open movement with a steadiness and economy that didn't match a man who'd picked up a watch once or twice out of sentiment. His fingernail traced the edge of the balance cock without touching the wheel beneath it. He turned the crown a quarter rotation and listened to nothing, or something Beckett couldn't hear, and then he set the crown back. "The staff is broken at the lower pivot," Owen Marchand said, more to himself than to Beckett, "but the wheel itself is intact. The jewels look clean." Beckett said nothing. "Your supplier problem," the old man continued, still looking through the loop, "is you're looking for a replacement staff. That's the right instinct for a modern watch. But a 992B balanced staff isn't complicated. The pivot diameter is around 0.07 millimeters. The roller table's still seated." He set the loop down and looked at Beckett directly. "You could turn a new staff." The shop was quiet. Somewhere in the back a clock ticked. "On a lathe," Beckett said slowly. "On a small lathe, watchmaker's lathe." Owen Marchand set the watch gently back on the counter. "I know it's not something most shops do anymore. It's faster to order parts. But when there's no part to order, we have a Bowley," Beckett said, almost despite himself. "In the back. It was here when I bought the shop. I've used it a few times for bushing work." He paused. "I've never turned a balance staff from scratch." Owen Marchand looked at him without judgment. "No reason you'd have to," he said. "It's a dying skill. Most of the men who learned it are dead, a beat, or close to it." Something shifted in the shop. It was subtle. The way the quality of silence in a room can change when the conversation turns a corner. "Have you done it?" Beckett asked. Owen Marchand didn't answer immediately. He looked at the Bowley lathe through the window to the back room, visible through the open doorway. "Yes," he said finally. "If you've never seen a watchmaker's lathe, you might picture something industrial. Heavy, loud, aggressive. You'd be wrong. A watchmaker's lathe is a precise and delicate instrument, small enough to sit on a desk, quiet enough to let you hear your own breathing. The Bowley that Tyler Beckett had inherited with his shop was a Geneva pattern model, Swiss-made, probably from the early 1970s, and it was in better condition than he'd expected when Owen Marchand came through from the front and stood before it. The old man was quiet for a moment. He ran his hand along the headstock without touching any of the adjustments. He checked the collet. He examined the tool rest. "Have you got a graver?" he asked. Beckett opened the drawer below the lathe and pulled out a tray of watchmaking tools. Inherited along with the machine, used infrequently, organized by a previous owner whose name he didn't know. Owen Marchand sorted through them without hurry. He selected a small graver, checked its edge under the loop, and set it aside. Then he selected a piece of steel rod from a small compartment in the tray. The previous owner had kept a set of pivot steel, which was unusual and fortunate, and held it up to the light. "This will do," he said. Beckett stood back and watched. What followed was not fast. It was not dramatic in the way that word usually means. Owen Marchand sat on the stool before the bowlie and worked with a patience and silence that made the room feel different, quieter, heavier, the way a library feels different from an ordinary room. He mounted the steel in the collet, he set the graver, he worked the foot pedal of the lathe with a rhythm so slow and controlled it seemed almost meditative. Beckett had made coffee. He'd offered Owen a cup. The old man had accepted it without looking up from the lathe. The coffee sat at his elbow going cold. The work of turning a balance staff, forming the pivot, the shoulder, the roller seat, the hairspring collet seat, is invisible in scale. The tolerances are measured in hundredths of a millimeter. The difference between a staff that works and a staff that doesn't is less than the width of a human hair. There's no margin and no forgiveness, which means the person doing the work has to carry the margin and the forgiveness inside themselves, in the steadiness of their hand and the reading of their eye. Owen Marchand worked for just under 2 hours. He didn't speak much. When he did, it was brief. At one point, he asked Beckett for a polishing lap. At another, he asked about the condition of the roller table jewel. Beckett answered as precisely as he could, and the old man nodded and went back to work. The other staff member, a young woman named Chloe, who handled the shop's front and administrative work, had come back from lunch and now stood in the doorway watching. She didn't say anything. Neither did Beckett. There was something in what they were seeing that discouraged interruption, the way you don't speak during the delicate part of a surgery. When Owen Marchand finally set down the graver and turned off the lathe and held the new staff up to the light, Tyler Beckett leaned in without being invited. It was perfect, or close enough to perfect that the difference would never matter. The old man fitted the new staff to the wheel using a staking set from Beckett's own toolkit, working with a precision that never showed strain. He poised the wheel, he checked the pivot under the loop, he set it back in the movement. Then he closed the case back and wound the watch. The sound in that small shop, the thin, clean, resolute ticking of a Hamilton 992B that had not moved in 4 years, was the kind of sound that asks something of you, that asks you to stop for a second and pay attention to where you are. Beckett paid attention. Owen Marchand set the watch back on the counter. He looked at it for a moment, hearing what he'd been trying to bring back. Then he picked it up and turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight again, and something in his face changed. Not much, but enough that Beckett noticed. "Your father carried this?" Beckett asked. "On the railways," Owen Marchand said. "Ottawa to Montreal, Montreal to Quebec City. During the war, mostly, they were running supply trains around the clock." Beckett nodded. He'd known none of this 2 hours ago. He knew it now the way you know the outline of a country after looking at it on a map. Shaped without depth, but shape is somewhere to start. "You were in the army," Beckett said. It wasn't quite a question. "A long time ago," Owen Marchand said. That was all he said about it, which was entirely in keeping with how he'd been since he walked in. He didn't offer details. He didn't explain himself. He'd fixed the thing and that was enough. He reached for his jacket. "What do I owe you?" he asked. Beckett shook his head slowly. "Nothing." Owen Marchand frowned. Not offended, but the frown of a man who pays his debts and doesn't like exceptions. "I used your lathe. I used your materials. You also," Beckett said, "just did something I didn't think was possible this morning, and you did it in my shop, which means I got to watch." He paused. "That's worth something to me." The old man looked at him for a moment, then he put on his jacket. "I learned it from a Belgian," he said. "In Hull, 1967. He was 60 years old, and he had hands like a surgeon, and he charged a fair rate for everything he did." He picked up the watch and set it in his breast pocket, the same pocket where it had rested decades ago. "He told me once that every trade has a language, and if you don't speak it, you can't hear what's broken." He buttoned his jacket. "Most of the men who speak this particular language," he said, not unkindly, "are running out of time." He looked at Beckett steadily. "I'd learn the lathe work if I were you. There'll be more watches like this one. More people who want them back." He said goodbye to Chloe on his way out. He held the door for an older woman who was coming in. And then he was on the street, in the grey October light, walking in the direction of the river. Beckett stood in the doorway of his back room for a long time. After Owen Marchand left, he was looking at the Bowley lathe, at the small tray of pivot steel, at the graver that was still sitting where the old man had left it, its edge catching the light. Chloe said from the front, "Do you know who that was?" "No," Beckett said. "He was in here about 4 years ago," she said. "Before you bought the shop, he brought in an alarm clock. One of those old sessions mantel clocks. The previous owner couldn't figure it out. She paused. He fixed it in about 20 minutes and wouldn't take any money. Beckett said nothing. I looked him up afterward, Chloe said. Owen Marchand. He used to be a watchmaker, but before that he was... She stopped. Actually, I don't think I got the details right. Something to do with Korea. Beckett picked up the graver from the workbench and looked at it. Get me the number of the Abisai, he said. The American, Canadian Watchmaking Guild, and see if there's a course anywhere on lathe turning, pivot work. Chloe looked at him. Within driving distance, he added, or I'll travel. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then he made that look easy. I know, Beckett said. It wasn't easy, she said. I know that too, Beckett said. He set the graver back down carefully in the exact position Owen Marchand had left it. That's the point. Isabeau Marchand was 14 years old and deeply skeptical of anything her grandfather called interesting, because his definition of interesting and hers had almost nothing in common, and she was at the age where she'd rather die than admit that gap was closing. She was sitting at his kitchen table when he came home, doing homework that she clearly wasn't doing, phone face down in the way that meant she'd just turned it over. And she looked up when he came in and did the thing young people do when they're pretending they haven't been waiting. Owen Marchand set his jacket on the hook by the door. You're still here, he said. Mom said to wait, Isabeau said. He went to the kitchen and put on water for tea. He was quiet about it. He moved around the small apartment the way he moved through everything, with an economy that took up no extra space and made no extra noise. Isabeau watched him from the table. Did you get the watch fixed? She asked, pretending she wasn't very interested. He came back out of the kitchen and sat across from her at the table. He reached into his breast pocket and set the 992B between them. It was ticking. She stared at it. Then she looked up at him. How? A lathe, he said. The shop had one. I made a new part. Isabeau looked back at the watch. The sound of it was quiet but insistent. She'd never been in a room with a ticking pocket watch before, and she didn't know why it felt different from the sound of a clock on the wall, but it did. It felt closer, more serious. Grandpa, she said slowly, did you actually make a tiny little metal piece? Yes, he said, like a tiny piece. Very small, he said. That's kind of insane, she said. He considered this. It's a skill, he said. It's learnable. Anyone with patience and the right instruction. Can you teach me? He stopped. She was looking at him with the directness that young people deploy when they've caught you off guard. Not calculating, just honest, leaning slightly forward the way people do when they actually want to know. Owen Marchand looked at his granddaughter. He thought about a Belgian named Picard in a shop in Hull in 1967, who had been 60 years old and had handed a young man a graver and said without sentiment, "The first thing you learn is not to rush. Everything else follows from that." "It takes time," he said. "I have time," Isabeau said. "I have lots of time. It's Saturday." He almost smiled. He caught it before it got away. "The first thing you learn," he said, pulling the watch across the table toward him and opening the case back, tilting it so she could see inside, is to look before you touch. You learn what a movement is supposed to look like before you learn how to change anything. He paused. "Can you be patient enough to just look?" Isabeau leaned over the watch. She looked at the tiny wheels and the hairspring and the jewels set in their brass plates. She was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet, the homework forgotten, the phone forgotten. "It's like a city," she said. "Yes," Owen Marchand said. "That's exactly what it is." The tea kettle began to whistle from the kitchen. He got up to get it, and Isabeau stayed bent over the watch, looking at the city inside it, listening to it keep its time. There's a thing that gets lost when knowledge stops being passed down. It isn't just the skill itself. The graver technique, the pivot diameter, the poising method. Those can be written down, more or less, and some of them have been. What gets lost is harder to name. It's the feel of something in your hands. It's the ability to listen to a mechanism and hear where the problem lives. It's the confidence to sit down in front of something broken and believe, without being reckless, that you have something to offer it. Owen Marchand walked into Tyler Beckett's shop that October morning as a man nobody knew, carrying a watch nobody could fix, and he walked out again the same man. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't stay to be thanked. He'd learned his trade in a small shop in Hull under a man who'd learned it in Belgium, and somewhere in that chain of teaching and learning and patient, painstaking work, a skill had survived that might otherwise have ended. Beckett signed up for a course in Geneva pattern lathe work 6 weeks later. He drove to Toronto for the weekend and came back with sore eyes and a notebook full of diagrams and a small piece of hardened steel that he'd turned himself, imperfect but functional. A first attempt at a balance staff for a cowl, 970 movement he'd found at an estate sale. He kept it on the shelf above the bowlie, not framed, not displayed, just sitting there where he could see it. A reminder that some things can be made when they can't be found, and that the people who know how to make them are still out there, in plaid jackets, walking along rivers, not saying much. And that if you're paying attention, they might walk through your door. You just have to be ready to ask them to look.